Hello everybody. Today I'm going to be showing you how I convert D&D 3.5 monsters to D&D 5e. And the reason why I do this is because there's a lot of great monsters from D&D 3.5 that never got a 5e version for them. And that kind of makes sense considering that there's 5 monster manuals, a Fiend Folio, the Libris Mortis Book of Undead, Sandstorm, Frostburn, Stormrack, and many other 3.5 edition books that were full of monsters to use in your campaigns, and it would be difficult to bring all of those into 5e with official versions. They did with a few like the Cadaver Collector, and quite a few others, honestly, but there are still hundreds and hundreds of great monsters in 3.5 that unfortunately just don't see the light of day anymore. So I do my best to convert them into D&D 5e. I've converted a couple hundred D&D 3.5 monsters to 5th edition stats, some of which since then actually got official 5e versions, but for the most part, they do not. A lot of them have just been left behind. So I'm going to be showing you my process for doing it and some just tips and tricks. We're going to be using the Carnage Demon today. This is a pretty simplistic creature. This is a demon that gets lost in the mad frenzy of combat. Sometimes ends up tearing his own allies to pieces. It's just a big, strong demon that attacks with his claws, and very violent, savage attacker, which is a bit of a foreshadowing for what we'll see later. So let's take a look at the Carnage Demon. It's challenge rating 4. It's got a 20 strength, 10 dex, 14 con, and then single digits for all its mental scores. And it's got a few special abilities. One is Destructive Appetite, where after it hits in melee, it's got to do a will save or attack the nearest creature that isn't a Carnage Demon. It has a Carnage ability where it gets a +1 on attack and damage rolls for each other Carnage Demon within 30 feet. And it has Reaving Fists, where its slam attacks ignore damage reduction that can be overcome by metallic material. So it's very good at bashing things to pieces. This monster would be able to claw through an Iron Golem pretty easily, which is fairly impressive considering that most monsters have a lot of trouble with that. So looking at the 3.5 stats, it's got 13 armor class, which is very low. In 5e, that's not too abnormal, but a 13 AC in 3.5 is very low. It's got 19 hit points, which might be surprising for a challenge rating 4 creature, considering in 5e that'd be like a challenge rating a quarter creature. But that's how it is. And it's got the resistance to acid, cold, and fire, except in 3.5 it's a flat reduction of 10. It does have damage reduction 5/silver, which is a bit odd considering that demons in 3.5 usually needed cold iron to bypass their damage reduction. It was devils that needed silver, but that might have just been an oversight. Damage reduction obviously is not a thing really in 5e aside from damage thresholds for objects and stuff like the medium armor master or heavy armor master, forget which feat. But it was in 3.5, and it was a lot less forgiving than the resistances and immunities in 5e are actually. It was, if anything, it was worse, because sometimes you need multiple things, such as a piercing and good aligned weapon to be able to take out a Rakshasa and bypass its 15 damage reduction. Otherwise, you were taking 15 off of each of your attacks, and that would be pretty painful. But looking at the Carnage Demon, you see basically it's got 2 slams, and it's got these 3 abilities here, and that's really all that there is to the monster. So I'm going to go into Home Brewery, which is a really great tool for creating homebrew content for 5e and making it look like the format in the 5e books. So here you can see I've done a little bit of work already in this Carnage Demon. It's a medium-sized fiend, parentheses demon. It's got a 13 natural armor class, and I do like to try to keep some things from the original monster. My main priority is keeping it the same challenge rating, because I think that's a core part of the monster. What challenge rating is shows where it is in the game in terms of power level and everything. I've almost never changed the monster's challenge rating if I can avoid it. The ability scores I do try to keep the same, and in this case I have, but something that's important to note about the ability scores translating from 3.5 to 5e is that in 5e, stats have a cap at 30. There's no stats that go above 30. And in 3.5, that's not the case. There will be, like, for example, a Storm Giant will have a 33 strength. A Tarask will have a 45 strength. But in 5e, a Tarask has a 30 strength because that's just as high as stats go. They don't go above 30. Even if it might make sense for them to, just for the sake of the math of the system and the bounded accuracy, they're capped at 30. So there's two consequences of this. One, when we're converting a monster, we can't have any of our stats go over 30. It just does not fit with the 5e system to do that. Technically, you could say, yeah, this monster is a 32 strength and a plus 11 stat modifier. That would work in 3.5, but in 5e it just does not fit the expectations of the system. So you should never do that. The other thing to keep in mind is for stats to go above 20, there's sort of a different metric because you could, while there's no upper bound to stats in 3.5 to ability scores, probably realistically like 50 is as high as you'll see them go in most cases. There are some in the epic level handbook that go higher. And even then, like a stat of 50 is really extreme and exceptional. But in that case, you have the range of 20 to 30 in 5e is equivalent to that range of 20 to 50, or even like 20 to 40 in 3.5. So to make this, to put out an example for this, a Storm Giant has like a 33 strength in D&D 3.5, but only has like a 28 or 29 in 5e. And even like an Ogre has a 19 strength, whereas there's like a 21 in 3.5. So for stats that go above 20, most of the time you're going to want to tone them down a bit to kind of fit that sort of scaling of stats above 20 in 5e versus in 3.5. Because that range of 10 from 20 to 30 has to represent everything from a Tarask to just a really strong Barbarian. Whereas in 3.5 they just went wild with the stats. So that's one important thing to keep in mind right off the bat. After that, what I try to do with my monster is take a look at the stats by challenge rating table. Taking a look at this can tell you a lot about what your monster's stats ought to be. So there's a challenge rating 4 monster. It should have an armor class of 14, 116 to 130 hit points, a plus 5 to hit, and about 30 average damage per round. And these are all flexible, of course. In fact, there's a really nice challenge rating calculator here that will take all of the various modifiers and such from the Dungeon Master's Guide for figuring out the monster challenge rating and just put it into a calculator. So what I like to do is I like to make the monster stats somewhat around what I think they should be, and then plug it into this calculator and then make adjustments as necessary. It'll show you the offensive challenge rating and the defensive challenge rating. Usually the offensive challenge rating is going to be a little bit higher with 5e monsters, but it will be compensated for by the defensive CR. So what I've done with this Carnage Demon here is I've kept those base stats. A 20 is a little bit high. My original conversion for this monster had it as an 18 strength, but I'm going to keep it at 20 just because this guy is pretty strong. He's got abyssal energy flowing through his muscles, so it makes sense for him to have a strength that's a little bit higher. This is higher than an Ogre, for an example, but it just makes sense for such a very muscular demon, supernaturally strong demon to have. And really, strength is one of his only assets, really. For speed, we're going to keep the speed the same, 30 feet. Dark vision, all demons in 5e have dark vision 120 feet. So even though the original monster only has dark vision of 60 feet, I've decided to keep it at 120 to fit in with the expectations of 5e. And that's something that I'm really particular about when I do these monster conversions. I want the monster to fit in with 5th edition's expectations as much as possible. And that means that a lot of abilities, like ability drain and damage, where they would reduce ability scores in 3.5, a lot of monster attacks like poison and such would drop ability scores, or they'd have attacks that would just drain wisdom. Usually you have to convert that to psychic damage or something of the like in 5e. And that's fine, and you can add other status effects on top of it to kind of replicate the effect of losing wisdom, for example. It'd be a disadvantage on wisdom saving throws or wisdom checks or something like that. That can be a good way of representing it if you feel like it. You definitely have to go by how the monster feels, and you don't want to overload it with too many abilities. So I've given this monster 13 armor class. I've preserved its original natural armor bonus, and that's fine because 13 is a pretty reasonable armor class for 5e. And it makes sense for this creature to have a kind of low armor class since it's this very reckless brawler type of creature anyway. 84 hit points. It does have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical attacks, which is standard for demons. So it makes sense for it to have 84 hit points instead of 116. There is a modifier there for the effective hit points of a creature depending on its challenge rating, for them to need a magic weapon to deal full damage to them. Because if nobody in the party has a magic weapon, then they're going to be going up against 168 hit points a monster, and that's a problem. And if you had a party of all fighters with mundane weapons, they would have a pretty hard time with this creature. So let's move on. Now, I pasted in the default stat block, so there is a little bit of gibberish here. They just kind of had like silly stuff to fill in, but I've started working on the Carnage ability. So this is where I kind of have to apply my own creativity, because I'm not a huge fan of the Carnage ability as it works in 3.5. It doesn't really fit 5e. Carnage says, for each other Carnage demon within 30 feet, a Carnage demon gets a +1 bonus on attack rolls and damage rolls up to a maximum of +5. Now this requires a lot of bookkeeping mentally, because every time one of your Carnage demons goes to attack, you have to count how many other Carnage demons are within 30 feet. Now realistically that's not too much of an issue, because they're probably all crowded together in melee. There's probably only like 4 or 5 of them. But even so, just counting up how many there are is a little bit annoying, and it's just a flat bonus to damage. And the idea here is that these monsters are, when they get together, they go in a sort of blood frenzy, and they, have the supernatural sort of aura that convinces them to attack even more savagely. But as I said, they are savage attackers at the beginning, and when I looked at this, I thought about what else 5e has, and I thought about the savage attacker feat, which lets you re-roll damage once per round for an attack. And thinking about this, I thought that it might apply well here. I like to use 5e material whenever I can, change it and mold it a little bit, because 5e doesn't really do well with flat bonuses to attacks and damage. I mean, there is Rage, which is just a flat bonus to damage, but generally speaking, it's all about either adding dice, which is an option here, or it's about re-rolls or rolling twice and taking the best or something like that. And so to fit in with that, I decided not to go for something like Pack Tactics, which in my opinion is kind of overused. We could just give this Carnage Demon Pack Tactics, and it would make sense for the bonus to hit from other demons being nearby. But it's not really Pack Tactics. They're not really working together. It's just that when there's others within 30 feet of them, they go into this sort of blood frenzy that makes them attack more violently and deal more damage. So I'm going to focus more on the damage roll side of things. They don't really need a bonus to attack rolls. That doesn't really help. And I think it's a little bit less interesting to give things a bonus to attack. So what I'm going to do for the Carnage ability is I'm going to go to... this is 5e Tools. If you're not aware, this is a really great website for 5e reference, for calculators and generators and stats and all manner of other things. So this has all of the feats, and I'm going to go down to Savage Attacker and just take a look at that rules text there. Basically it just says once per turn when you hit a target with weapon, you can roll the weapon's damage dice twice and use either roll against the target. And so I'm going to steal this text here, and I'm going to add it to my ability, and then I'm going to go for Pack Tactics, so we just need to go to like Kobold, for example. Kobolds have Pack Tactics, and it's just basically they have advantage on a creature attacking it if at least one of their allies are within 5 feet and aren't incapacitated. So I'm going to steal that conditional part here for my rules text as well. And I'm going to kind of like rewrite this here. And maybe I won't make this once per turn, because it might be difficult to track that, and especially if there's like, I mean, it's once per turn, of course, but then you have to worry about like opportunity attacks and the like. So I'm just going to say whenever the Carnage Demon hits with a weapon attack or with a melee attack, if at least one Carnage Demon is, within 30 feet of the Carnage Demon and it isn't incapacitated. The Carnage Demon can roll the attack's damage dice twice and use either roll against the target. The wording here might be a little bit off. Wording is very important to me with 5e abilities because they did do a really good job of making sure that things were well worded, that there's not a whole lot of loopholes, and they put all the explanation that you need into the stat block for the creature. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the other abilities this monster has and decide how we're going to incorporate that as well. Now, one thing is that you don't have to include every single ability that the monster has in 3.5 into its 5e version. It's not really important. But a monster like this that only has 3 abilities and not a whole lot else going for it, it would be good if we could bring all of this monster's abilities into its 5e version. So Destructive Appetite. This basically is after it attacks, it has to make a will save or attack the nearest creature other than a Carnage Demon. This should be pretty easy to bring in, so we can just go ahead and add it. We'll just add Destructive Appetite. And we're going to do whenever the Carnage Demon hits, damages a creature with a melee attack. Now we have to be careful how exactly we're going to incorporate this ability, because having it occur just whenever it hits is going to lead to a lot of extra rolls, especially since this creature has 2 slam attacks. Now, one thing that I do with my homebrew monsters is I will use stuff like whenever damage is over a certain threshold, like if the monster deals 10 or more damage with its slam attack, then it will have this extra effect, or 15 or more damage. But the thing you have to watch out for is that some people do actually use the static damage in 5e, and because of that, relying on the damage roll to kind of randomize things doesn't work quite as well. That said, we are already doing this sort of pseudo-savage attacker thing, so people that are using these static damage numbers are already going to be missing out when it comes to this monster. So one thing that we might want to consider is how to incorporate this. We might say whenever the Carnage Demon scores a critical hit with a melee attack, it must succeed on a DC, and we're going to make it a DC 10 save simply because of how, actually we might even just make it we might just make it a DC 10 wisdom saving throw. Now if it was every round, we might make it like a DC 5, so there's this kind of low chance that it would cause itself to go into this kind of blood frenzy and attack some other creature. Alright, so this is what we'll do for Destructive Appetite. Now this one is not a very great ability. I'm not super proud of this. Basically, whenever the Carnage Demon scores a critical hit with a melee attack, it must succeed on a DC 10 Wisdom saving throw. It must make a DC 10 Wisdom saving throw. Otherwise it'd be an or thing. It must make a DC 10 Wisdom saving throw. On a failed save, on its next turn, it makes all of its melee attacks against a random creature within 5 feet of it that isn't a Carnage Demon. Not the absolute best wording, but it works well enough. There's a lot higher standard, again, for wording of abilities in D&D 5e. A random creature within 5 feet of it. Okay, well, you should be able to figure out how to determine that randomly. I guess you could say it uses its action on its next turn to make all of its melee attacks against a random creature within 5 feet of it. We could take a look at the wording for something like Confusion, just to be sure about how we're wording this one here. And this might seem a little bit obsessive, but I do like to be as particular as possible when it comes to this. Okay, this is just on its next turn. It takes the attack action to... Okay, well, that's not going to help us too much there. But this is probably good enough, and honestly, people are going to know what this means, at least, so that's the important thing, as long as there's not ambiguity there. One problem that a lot of 3.5 monsters would have is they'd say something lasts one round. Well, is that... Okay, that's until its next, initiative. Is it the start of its turn? The end of its turn? Whereas... And they did mention, like, what that actually meant. I think it was, like, the start of the monster's turn. But it was buried in the glossary somewhere, and that's not really helpful. Whereas here, it will say, so-and-so is paralyzed until the start of this monster's next turn, or until the end of their next turn, or something like that. So it's very explicit and obvious how these abilities function. And I think that's really important. I think that's a positive aspect of D&D 5e as opposed to D&D 3.5, actually. So we're going to put that there. And then the last ability that this monster has is its Reaving Fists. So to bring this one in, and this will be an ability under its like traits and not under its attacks or anything. So let's go back to looking at the Golem, because the Golem, and actually a lot of demons in general will have the magic attack trait. It just says the Golem's weapon attacks are magical. So we can just do, we can add in Reaving Fists. So Reaving Fists here says the demon slams ignore damage reduction that can be overcome by any metallic material, such as silver, cold iron, or adamantine. Very easy for us to translate that into, in fact, I believe that I actually have that one saved in one of my other monsters that I've made. Perhaps not. Maybe it was under the adamantine Golem. I've done quite a lot of these. I might have, might not have. But anyway. So what we'll do for this is we will put Reaving Fists. And we'll say the Carnage Demon's weapon attacks count as silver or adamantine. And that works pretty well for getting across the point. Again, not the absolute best wording, but for the demonstration it makes sense. And now we're going to move on to its attacks. Now in this case it's pretty simple because he's only got these 2 slam attacks, so we're going to give him his multi-action or multi-attack first. And then we're going to go ahead and give him his slam attack. Now his slam attacks are going to need to do 30 damage altogether, so about 15 damage each, and that's kind of difficult. The best we might be able to do is like 12 damage off of 2d6 plus 5 for his strength, and hopefully his attack bonus makes up somewhat for that, just by virtue of adding to the attack power, even if not the damage directly. So it's going to be, 2d6 plus 5 would be an average of 12 bludgeoning damage, and be reach of 5 feet, and it would be plus 7 to hit, which will help out a little bit. That's above the expectation. So what we're going to do now, we have the Carnage ability, and this will buff the Carnage Demon's damage. I'm just going to input that as pack tactics for the sake of the challenge rating calculator. Are they equivalent? Not really, but in this case, I'm just going to, let that happen. And then Destructive Appetite, yeah, it's a downside. It doesn't really affect the monster's challenge rating. Critical hits don't come up very often. And then Reaving Fists, that just doesn't affect his challenge rating at all. That's never going to matter. But it is nice to have it there as a trait. It's a good flavorful thing, and it does make sense for the monster, and its sort of supernatural ability to damage, you know, devils, for example, even though they don't really care about that, or to attack shadows. Shadows, I believe, have damage resistance against non-silvered attacks. So we're going to plug these stats in and see what it gives us. And you put in the expected challenge rating because that does determine how much the resistance to magical, non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing matters. We didn't give it any save proficiencies. A lot of demons do have those, but we're not going to bother in this case. 13 armor class, 84 hit points. Damage per round you calculate by if all of the attacks were to hit. And if they were, then it would do 24 total damage, once for each of his 2 slams. So we put in 24. We put in the +7 at first to hit. And then we can see that this guy actually has a challenge rating of 5. Which is above what you'd expect. That's because his defensive challenge rating is a bit high. So, and we haven't even put in the pack tactics yet, so let's put that in. And actually this creature now has an offensive challenge rating of 5. So his offensive challenge rating is actually a little bit too much. And when we go down here and look at the effective hit points, it's 168. So when you're challenge rating 4 or below and you have resistance to typical damage, and we're going to take a look actually at exactly what it says. Or take a look at what those resistances actually mean. Expected challenge rating, HP multiplier for resistances is ×2, because they're not really expecting you to have a magical weapon yet. So let's take a look and see if that really is the case, because this is where things get a little bit tricky. Let's take a look at the Babao demon here. This is a challenge rating 4 monster. It's a demon. It's right on the money. It's got the same exact resistances that our Carnage demon does. And it's got a 16 armor class, which is better than our monster. It's got 82 hit points, same resistances. And it has 2 melee attacks that each do 8 damage. And it's also got a kind of a debuffing effect. So while it's doing about 10 less damage per round, it has about these same stats. So we could reduce its hit points a little bit. But let's take a look at what happens if we plug the Babao demon into our challenge rating calculator. It's the same challenge rating. It's got 82 hit points, a 16 armor class, and it's got 2 melee attacks. Let's say that, either of them do 8 damage per hit, and they're +6, so you have 16, and it's +6 to hit. So if we do that, keep those resistances in there. We'll take out the pack tactics thing because he doesn't have that. It still says he's challenge rating 5. It says he has a defensive challenge rating of 7. And it really doesn't look like he has any vulnerabilities here to speak of. So because of that, I think we can be a little bit more tolerant with the higher effective hit points. This resistances thing is a little bit difficult to be precise with, but we can maybe drop these hit points a little bit. So maybe what we'll do is we will try to give this Carnage demon 10 hit dice instead of 13. So that would be 45 plus 20. So we have 65 hit points. He does a little bit more damage, so that would be fair. And he does have this Carnage ability giving him a little bit more damage as well. So if we do that and give him 65 hit points, 13 armor class, 24 damage, attack bonus of +7, give him back those pack tactics, keep the resistances, and now we're pretty much on the money. The defensive CR is still a little bit high, but we can say that there's going to be a lot of magical damage being flung this guy's way. So his effective hit points are not really 130. That's a little bit unrealistic to assume that it's a whole party that's attacking with mundane weapons. But as is, this is pretty good. I think we'll leave it there for his stats. Something I would go into maybe more in future videos is how to really calculate what the monster's hit points should be, and how you should really be comparing it to other monsters of similar challenge rating more. The challenge rating table is really great, and I do understand why in the 2024 Monster Manual they removed a lot of that resistance to non-magical damage. I mean, they took that away from a lot of monsters, and while I disagree in some regards, I will say it is a bit overused as well, just like damage reduction was overused in D&D 3.5, so I can understand why they did that. But here we go. You have a Carnage Demon with 65 hit points, 13 armor class, 20 strength, 10 dex, 14 con, 5 intelligence, 6 wisdom, and 6 charisma. He's got the resistances and immunities you'd expect from a demon, and he's got the abyssal for his languages. And we managed to fit in all of his abilities and his 2 attacks, and it's a pretty compact stat block. And if this monster were designed specifically for 5th edition, the Reaving Fists ability probably wouldn't exist. We could also add in something maybe about it ignoring, like, or getting a bonus against damage thresholds for objects. The Destructive Appetite is kind of oddly worded, but I think it's important to preserve some of that identity of the monster from 3.5. I didn't in my original conversion. Actually, its Destructive Appetite basically gave it a frenzy type ability to just attack a random creature next to it when it killed something. So that's an interesting way of going about it as well. So that might be a different way of handling this. I like it triggering on a critical hit just because, and it could also just be on its next turn it gets to make that, or as an immediate attack or something like that. It gets just a free immediate thing as a reaction maybe. That might be a better way of wording this. But this is just a basic demonstration of how I convert a monster from 3.5 to 5e. I've done a lot of these on my blog, which is thirdtofifth.tumblr.com. And I've done a couple hundred of these. Some of the older ones, definitely from when I was newer to converting monsters to 5e, they don't fit into the expectations of 5e quite as well. But as I've gone on, I have gotten better, and I've gone back over some of those older monsters I've done conversions for and redone them. This is one example of that. So my goal eventually is to convert every single monster from 3.5 that doesn't already have official 5e stats into 5e in one way or another. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely subscribe to this channel. I'll try to post some more videos like this. And you can definitely check out that blog, which I will link in the description as well. Go take a look, and hopefully you find some cool monsters to use in your next D&D 5e session. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.